A molecular biologist pulled DNA from soil that had been sitting 30 feet below a Manhattan street for over 300 years. She ran the sequence. She expected West Africa. The maternal lineages came back from East Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, from places the slave ships were never supposed to have touched. She ran it again. Same result. And the findings she published quietly dismantled something that historians, genealogists, and the entire documentary record of the transatlantic slave trade had been telling African Americans about their origins for 3 centuries. It was not wrong in the way a small error is wrong. It was wrong in the way that a story missing half its chapters is wrong. And the only reason anyone found out is that a construction crew in Lower Manhattan broke ground in 1991 and hit something 30 feet down that no government agency had planned for. Here's what they found, and here's what the DNA said. In the fall of 1991, the United States federal government was breaking ground for a new office building at a site on Broadway in Lower Manhattan, a few blocks north of City Hall. They had done their surveys. They had checked the historical maps. They were confident about what was underneath. They were wrong. On the second day of digging, equipment hit something it should not have hit. Then it hit another. By the end of that first week, workers had uncovered intact human burials, carefully arranged, carefully preserved, and clearly African in origin. And as the excavation expanded, the scale of what lay beneath that street became impossible to minimize. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people had been buried in that ground. Researchers would later confirm it was the oldest and largest colonial-era African burial ground ever discovered in North America. Men, women, and children. Some born in Africa and carried across the ocean in the holds of ships. Others born in the colony they were building with their labor. The city had grown over them completely. Streets had been laid above them. Buildings had risen and been torn down and risen again. And for nearly 2 centuries, almost no one in New York had known they were there. The burial ground dated to the period between roughly the 1640s and the 1790s. By 1664, nearly 300 enslaved Africans already lived in what was then called New Amsterdam. Over the following century and a half, an estimated 17,000 enslaved people and their descendants would be buried in the ground that the city would eventually pave over and forget. These were the people who built the wall that gave Wall Street its name, who dug the foundations of the buildings that would make Manhattan into the city it became, who laid the streets and raised the structures and did the work that a young, growing colony could not have done without them. And then they were buried, without their names being kept, without their origins being recorded, without anyone in that city's official memory deciding they were worth remembering. The city forgot them not by accident. It forgot them on purpose, because they had never been considered worth the effort of remembering in the first place. When the discovery spread through the African American community in New York, people understood what they were looking at in a way the federal agency managing the construction project was slower to grasp. These were their people. These were the ones nobody had written down. Ministers showed up. Historians showed up. Ordinary New Yorkers who had no academic credentials, but whose families had been in the city for generations, showed up and stood at the fence around the excavation and looked at what was coming out of that ground and understood. The General Services Administration, the federal agency overseeing the project, initially treated the discovery as a logistical complication. Construction was on a schedule. There were deadlines. The remains were, in the administrative language of the moment, a delay. The community pushed back with enough force that it eventually reached Congress. Legislation was passed to halt construction on the most significant sections of the site. And when the question arose of who would conduct the scientific analysis of the remains, the descendant community had a specific and non-negotiable answer. Howard University, a historically black institution. Black scholars studying the remains of black ancestors buried in the ground of a city that still sometimes acted as if they had never existed. Dr. Michael Blakey led the team at Howard's W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory. He had spent years before this discovery thinking about how to conduct this kind of work ethically, how to study the remains of enslaved people without repeating the extractive, clinical, dehumanizing patterns of the science that had come before. When the community insisted that the analysis go to Howard, he understood exactly what that insistence meant and why it mattered. He later described standing at the edge of the excavation site and thinking that this was not an archaeological find in the ordinary sense. This was a community. These were people who had been deliberately forgotten, and the city had built itself on top of that forgetting. That thought, he said, stayed with him through every year of the work that followed. What his team produced over the years of analysis that followed was one of the most comprehensive bioarchaeological studies of an enslaved population ever undertaken anywhere in the world. The bones told stories the written record had never bothered to keep. Children who had been put to work young enough that the evidence of it was permanently written into their skeletons. When the body is pushed into hard physical labor before it has finished developing, it leaves a record that cannot be erased. The Howard team could read that record in the growth plates and the joint surfaces and the skeletal architecture of people who had been dead for 3 centuries, women whose spines showed compression fractures that formed from years of carrying heavy loads on the head, the ring-shaped lesion in the skull, called an orbital roof lesion, that develops from years of that specific kind of weight-bearing. It is a signature practice common across the African continent, and here it was written into bone, preserved underground for 300 years, evidence that people had brought something of their lives with them across the ocean, and continued it in a city that never thought to record it. Men whose arms and shoulders showed the repetitive strain injuries that come from sustained, heavy manual labor started at a young age. Children with growth disruptions in their bone structure, what scientists call Harris lines, the biological fingerprint of periods of severe malnutrition so extreme that normal skeletal development stopped, interrupting growth in a way that leaves a visible line in the bone even centuries later. These were not statistics. These were people. They had names their captors did not keep. They had languages, they had knowledge of agriculture and construction and navigation and medicine, and they had origins. Origins that the colonial record of Manhattan was never designed to preserve, because preserving the origins of enslaved people was not something the people running that colony thought was worth doing. The remains were returned to the ground with full honors in 2003, transported through 6 cities in hand-carved Ghanaian mahogany coffins, received by thousands of people who came out to pay respect to ancestors they had never known, and whose names they would never learn. The site became a national monument. A visitor center was built. A memorial was installed above the ground where those coffins were returned. And most people who heard the story at that point assumed that the scientific chapter had largely closed. It had not closed. It had barely started. Here's the part that almost no popular account of the African burial ground includes, because it did not happen in the dramatic days of the original discovery. It happened quietly in a laboratory, years later. When the physical remains were reinterred, they were no longer available for direct analysis. But Howard's laboratory still held something else: soil samples, collected simultaneously with the remains at the time of the original excavation in 1991, carefully stored, carefully preserved. And locked inside that soil, surviving for more than 300 years in the darkness under a Manhattan street, was ancient DNA. Not DNA from the bones, which were now back in the ground. DNA from the soil that had surrounded those bones for centuries. The material that the body leaves behind as it returns to the earth. Fragile, degraded, but present, and readable if you were patient enough and careful enough and had the methods to do it. Fatima Jackson is a biologist and anthropologist, a professor at Howard University, and the director of the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory, the same laboratory that had led the original scientific work on the burial ground. She has spent decades developing methods for understanding ancestry in populations whose documentary record was deliberately destroyed or never kept at all. The work she published in 2020 and elaborated in research and interviews that followed described what she and her colleagues found as they worked through the ancient DNA extracted from that burial soil. And what she found stopped people. Not because it was technically impossible, but because it contradicted something so deeply embedded in how the transatlantic slave trade has been understood for generations that almost no one had thought to question it. The assumption embedded in nearly every account of the slave trade is geographic: West Africa, the coasts of Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the Congo Coast, Angola. These were the ports. These were the places where the ships loaded their human cargo. The slave trade's historical record, such as it is built around those coastal departure points. And so the assumption followed naturally, almost automatically. The people buried in that ground came from West Africa, from the places the ships touched. That was the story. That was what everyone had been taught, and what the documentary record, thin and incomplete as it was, appeared to support. Jackson was looking at mitochondrial DNA. This is the genetic material passed from mother to daughter, unchanged across generations, a direct line running backward through time that no historical event can alter, no middle passage can erase, no colonial record keeper can falsify. Every person alive carries in their cells an unbroken maternal line running back through their mother, her mother's mother, and all the mothers before them, each one carrying the same sequence, unchanged, all the way back. It does not matter what the written record says. It does not matter what name was given at a dock, or what ship a person was loaded onto, or where that ship said it had come from. The mitochondrial line tells you where the maternal ancestors actually were, and what Jackson found in that soil was not what the assumption predicted. She said it plainly in her own words. The maternal lineages of African Americans come from all over Africa. From East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa, the majority from West and Central Africa, but also from Southern Africa, from Eastern Africa, from North Africa. The full span of the continent, not one coast, not one region, not the narrow geographic band that 3 centuries of records about port cities and slave ship manifests had led everyone to expect. Sit with what that means. The people buried 30 feet below a Manhattan street, the people who built this city's earliest infrastructure, the people the city buried and then built over and then forgot, those people came from all over Africa. Not just from the coasts the slave ships documented, from the interior, from the south, from the east, from places the standard account of the transatlantic slave trade had largely written out of the story because they did not appear prominently in the surviving records of the ships that have been studied most. The DNA is not saying the slave trade records are false. It is saying the slave trade records are incomplete. It is saying there were routes and methods and networks of human trafficking that moved people from places the official record barely mentions and put them in ships and carried them to Manhattan, where they built a city that then forgot their names and paved a street over their graves. This is not a small revision to the history. It is not a footnote. The difference between African Americans coming from one region of one continent and African Americans coming from the full geographic breadth of that continent is the difference between one story and a much larger, more complex, more difficult story. It changes the map of where Black America came from. It changes the shape of the family tree. And it could only be found by doing the one thing that 300 years of written records were never designed to do: asking the DNA. The bones had already begun to suggest this before the DNA work started. The Howard team found that many of the individuals in the burial ground had been born in Africa rather than in the colony. They could determine this from the chemical composition of the teeth. Teeth form in childhood, and record the mineral signature of the water and food consumed during those early years. That signature differs measurably from region to region, and in some cases can be narrowed to a continent or a subregion. West African chemical signatures appeared in many of the dental samples from the burial ground, but so did signatures that did not match the standard West African profile. Signatures that pointed to origins further east, further south, further inland than the documented slave trade routes would have predicted on their own. The bones were already complicating the story before a single strand of DNA had been extracted from the soil. The DNA, when it came, did not contradict the bones. It confirmed them and went further. Around the same time that Jackson's work was being published and absorbed, a landmark study was unfolding at a different burial site that extended the same implications. In August 2023, researchers from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, Harvard University, and 23andMe published a study in the journal Science that did something that had never been done before. They analyzed the ancient DNA of 27 African Americans buried in the late 18th and early 19th centuries at a place called Catoctin Furnace in Maryland, an iron forge that had relied on enslaved labor from its founding. And then, using a new genetic method, they cross-referenced those ancient sequences against 23andMe's database of consenting living research participants. The result connected those 27 people who died without their names being officially kept to nearly 42,000 living people in the United States today. Not approximately, not as a rough estimate, 41,799 living people with detectable genetic connections to individuals buried nameless in a Maryland cemetery more than 200 years ago. The highest concentration of close relatives was found in Maryland itself, suggesting that many of the descendants of Catoctin's enslaved workers had never moved far from the place where their ancestors were held. The study found that many of the Catoctin individuals carried African ancestry, linking them to the Wolof people of Senegambia and the Congo people of Central Africa, groups from 2 very different parts of the continent, often separated by thousands of miles, ending up in the same small cemetery at the foot of a mountain in Maryland. It found European ancestry in a majority of the 27, a finding that needed no elaboration for anyone who understands the documented history of what enslaved women in America were subject to from the people who claimed to own them. It found genetic risk markers for sickle cell anemia and for a condition called G6PD deficiency, both genetic patterns that have their highest frequencies in sub-Saharan Africa and that remain common among African Americans today. A biological thread running unbroken from those Maryland graves to living people who had no idea they were connected until a genetics database said otherwise. Historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. was among the scholars involved in the research. He described the study as opening a new possible way for Black Americans to trace their ancestry through a record system that was never designed to include them. That phrase is important. Never designed to include them. The written record of the transatlantic slave trade was kept by the people who ran the trade. It recorded what was useful to them. Names were often not kept, or kept incorrectly, or lost. Origins were not recorded with any precision because the people doing the recording did not consider that information to have value. The ship manifests that historians have spent decades analyzing are valuable documents. They are also profoundly incomplete documents. They tell us about the ports. They do not tell us about the interior routes, the networks of smaller traders and raiders who moved people from the interior of the continent toward the coast, the people who were already in transit for months or years before they reached a documented port. The DNA is not replacing those records. It is reading the evidence that those records were not built to capture. And what that evidence is revealing, site by site, burial ground by burial ground, as ancient DNA science improves and spreads, is that the geography of African America is more complex and more continental than anything the written record alone could show. The Anson Street African Burial Ground project in Charleston, South Carolina, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2023, analyzed 18 ancient genomes from 18th century African descended individuals and found a diversity of ancestral connections spanning Western Africa, including genetic affiliations with the Fulani people of West Africa, a group whose historical connection to the Atlantic slave trade has been less documented than others. Each study adds another piece. Each piece points the same direction. The ancestors came from more of Africa than the records ever acknowledged. For African Americans trying to understand where they come from, this has a significance that goes well beyond academic interest. Commercial DNA testing has become one of the primary ways that Black Americans have tried to recover some piece of the geographic origin that enslavement erased. Millions of people have sent their saliva to companies and received results telling them their African ancestry comes from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, or other West African populations. Those results are real, they are meaningful, and they are built on reference databases that are improving every year, but that still represent an incomplete picture of Africa's genetic diversity, a continent with more human genetic variation than any other on Earth, with populations whose distinctions run deeper and older than anywhere else. As the ancient DNA research expands, as more burial sites are studied, as more African genomes are sequenced and added to those reference databases, the picture that people get back when they test their DNA will become more detailed, more accurate, and more likely to reflect what Jackson found in that Manhattan burial soil, that the ancestors came from everywhere, not one country, not one coast, the whole continent. The soil from the New York African burial ground is still being worked. The laboratory is still open. The questions that the bones could not answer when they were in the ground are still being asked of the DNA they left behind in it. Ancient DNA science is moving faster now than it ever has before. The same methods being refined at Pumapunku and at burial sites across the American South are producing results that change what people know about themselves. Every sequence that comes back from that burial soil is another line the record never followed, another maternal lineage that the colonial record of Manhattan was never designed to preserve, another answer to a question that millions of living people have been asking about themselves for their entire lives without any document able to give it to them. The memorial above the burial ground stands. The coffins are in the earth below it. The monument that was built there sits in Lower Manhattan, near the streets that those buried people helped to build. Tourists visit, school groups come, and underneath the sidewalk beside it, in ground that survived everything the city erected on top of it, the laboratory is still reading, letter by letter, sequence by sequence, out of soil that 300 years of city did not destroy. What it is saying, carefully and slowly, to the researchers patient enough to listen, is what Fatma Jackson said when she described what she had found in those maternal lineages. The ancestors were not from one place. They were from everywhere, from all of Africa, from the places the records show and the places the records never bothered to look. And that changes everything. Not just about the history, about the present, about the 42,000 living people connected to 27 graves in Maryland, about the millions of people who have sent their DNA to a testing company hoping for an answer that the written record was never built to give them. The answer exists. It was preserved in the ground. And it is finally being read by the people it was always meant for.